My name is Hillary Cadillac. I'm the Associate Director of Public Relations here at BU. And I just want to thank everyone for attending today. This event is part of our Strategic Communication Series events, which is put on by the Office of Research and also the Public Relations and Social Media Office. Today we welcome Maggie Villiger, Senior Science and Technology Editor, and Emily Costello, Deputy Editor at The Conversation. And they're going to walk you through today a little bit about what The Conversation is, how you can best work with them, and some general tips for writing for a broader audience. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you. So I'm Maggie. I'm a science and technology editor at The Conversation. Thanks for having us. It was an easy trip over from our office near South Station. We actually launched from a basement office on the campus of BU, just across the street. I forget the street address, but on Comm Ave, so this is kind of like returning home for us. So The Conversation is a nonprofit, independent news and analysis website. We launched in the US, like I said, 5 years ago from a very local spot. And we are foundation funded and also university member funded. So Boston University is one of our supporting members. We have a special relationship with you guys. And I just want to take a moment to say thank you to you and the institution for supporting what we do. And we're hoping to get a lot of stories out of you guys by the time that we leave here today. We are free to read, free to republish. We are part of a global network of conversations. So around the world, we have sister sites, sometimes that use our content, sometimes we use theirs, sometimes it's also translated into French or Spanish for our Francophone or Spanophone brothers and sisters. We're different than most of the news and media that you consume because we're really a collaboration between scholars on one side and academics on the other. And maybe this tweet resonates with you. We're sort of coming from two different worlds. Academics, yes, let's meet in 7 months and 6 days at 2:08 p.m. Journalists, hi, can you comment for this article? It's due in 47 seconds. Also, I've left you 7 voicemails. So we recognize that we have different senses of quickness sometimes, and we have different areas of expertise. We're really turning to you as our content expert partners, and we have some expertise in how to communicate what you know. And we think that together there's a real synergy bringing together the two sides of the coin. All of our contributors are affiliated with academic institutions. So everything on our site is written by an academic scholar, edited by a journalist on staff, and aimed at the general public. We're a general interest publication, and we cover topics ranging from my science side to Emily's politics side to arts and culture to health and medicine to philanthropy, religion, pretty much anything that someone is studying within academia, we're interested in helping share that with the general public. We consider what we do to be what we call explanatory journalism. So rather than an op-ed that really is a bit more opinion-based, someone woke up in the morning and wants to pontificate on something that sort of hit them overnight, we really want to tie our articles to your research. We want everything to be backed up with studies or statistics or numbers, things that you yourself have studied or can pull in from other folks in your field. The Conversation is a very safe place to experiment with communicating with the public directly. We can't publish your article until you click a button at the end of the process that says you approve the story for publication. So there's no concern that you're going to be misquoted or that we'll weirdly, twist the argument into a direction that isn't what you intended. And as I mentioned, we always want to back everything up with links out to scholarly research and other kinds of primary sources. So it is very much grounded in, sorry to say, but fact-based journalism as opposed to opinion pieces. One thing that sets us apart is that we publish everything under a Creative Commons license. So rather than a regular copyright that's all rights reserved, we pick a different license that's most rights reserved, and that allows us to shop your story around to other media outlets to republish it for free. So your article possibly ends up getting picked up at any number of the other media outlets that we work with. These are some of the more recognizable ones. We also have a partnership with the Associated Press, as well as Community Newspaper Holdings, CNHI. So our material goes out to local papers across the country. All 50 states have published our stuff in print, as well as many online sources. And we're really excited about our collaboration with these local news producers, because Mineral Springs, Texas isn't necessarily going to go to a top opioid expert in Massachusetts who has a lot to say based on their own research about the opioid epidemic, but maybe people in that community could really benefit from hearing that story. So that's something that we're very excited about. And additionally, it's a way for you to write a story once and have it travel all over the place. If you wrote for a newspaper, say the New York Times, you would write that story one time and it would be in the New York Times, which, believe me, that's great. I don't want to dissuade you from doing that. But if you write for us, it will be on our site, and hopefully it will be picked up in multiple sites. So you only need to write it once, and we help it reach out into the world. And part of our deal with our republishers is that they let us track where the stories are going, and we share those metrics with you, so you're able to follow along and see where your story has traveled and who's reading it. The feedback we get from the scholars that we work with is overwhelmingly positive. I've heard working with an editor at The Conversation compared to working with a personal trainer at the gym. So it might be like a tiny bit painful while you're doing it, and maybe you're asking yourself, why did I sign up for this? But at the end of the process, you're very happy with the results, and you've learned something and possibly improved. So the idea for us is that we don't just want to have a great article at the end that you are proud of. We want you to perhaps learn a few skills that you can then transfer into the next piece you write, whether it's for us, or maybe it's an op-ed for the Boston Globe, or maybe you are communicating with a lawmaker or some other kind of decision maker. We want to help you learn how to craft your message in a slightly different way than you might be used to thinking about. We've also, in our author survey, found out what happens after people publish on our site. So this is kind of the what's in it for me slide. So 43% of the people who responded to our survey said that they had been approached by other academics to collaborate. So even sometimes people were approached by folks they had never heard or don't know, who already had funding and were looking for a collaborator to work with, which is pretty awesome. Almost a third of our authors notice an increase in the number of citations of their scholarly work. So that's a cold, hard number that people are usually happy to see. And then writing for us also positions you as an expert on the topic that you're writing about. So many journalists across the country, across the world, go to The Conversation when they're looking for sources. So say someone wants to publish an article about, water security. They'd type it in on our site and see that Professor Ali at Boston University published an article. They would call up that professor, and now they become a source for other journalism that's happening. So almost around a half of our authors said that they had been contacted to do a radio interview, more than a third to do a print interview. even people get book proposals based upon what they write for us. So there's a lot of what's in it for you kind of benefits as well. So I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Emily, now. Hopefully this little introduction has gotten your juices flowing and you're thinking about, well, maybe I might like to write for the conversation. What should I do? And here's Emily to tell you.
Thanks, Maggie. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Let's see, I'm really bad at advancing slides. Yeah, I'm going to give you some practical tips about how to pitch, both to us and maybe also some information that you can use to approach other media outlets as well. Thinking about how to write about your scholarship for the general public. A pitch is what we in the media call a story idea. So I'm going to tell you about how to pitch us. So these are basically the 4 questions that we encourage scholars to ask themselves when they're trying to look at their life's work and boil it down into one story that they're going to write for us, maybe especially their first story. So it's important to start out with the idea that most of our stories come in under 1,000 words. Because we work with republishers, we know that that's sort of a sweet spot. Once things get above 1,000 words, we had an editor at a conference recently tell us, I won't even look at anything over 1,000 words. It's usually not quite that extreme, but we want something manageable and small. And to be successful in writing something like that, it's important to do some pre-planning to think about what you can actually cover in an authoritative way in that much room. And we've been experimenting with even much shorter formats. So some of our stories are as short as 400 words. So start with that idea in mind. And then think about what you know. If you're approaching the conversation, a very important tenet of our editorial approach is that we're commissioning scholars who are really writing in their own wheelhouse. They're in their own lane. We have a ton of metaphors at the office to describe this, but we really want people to be writing about things that they are clearly identifiable as experts in. So think about what you know, and then if you think about all the things you know is an apple, you would just want to take one small bite out of that and focus on a small portion of it for your first piece. And then hopefully it'll be a good experience and you can take additional bites at of the apple as you go along. And then you want to ask, is this really a story that will interest the general public? You're looking for some sort of way to connect your work with the news agenda of the day. So more about that in a couple of slides. And you want something that people are going to want to read about. An important thing for us to think about is that I think, as you're well aware, it's a noisy media environment out there. We can't assign anyone to read your stories, unfortunately. We have to, we need a little sizzle. We need to sell the idea. It needs to be interesting to people. So if you really want people to read about the bottom of the ocean, you can probably think of some interesting ways to sell it. Maybe there's a charismatic animal that lives in the bottom of the ocean, like an octopus that changes colors. And if you get a really good video of that, you might be able to interest people at the bottom of the ocean. Or maybe you have a great narrative about people in a very small man-made craft who are going way, way down deep into the ocean to discover something that's going to save someone's life. So you're looking for that interesting hook. This is a slide. Unfortunately, don't have my detailed notes about this slide, but it's part of the reason why we feel like it's so important for you guys to do this work. This is a study that was done by the Op-Ed Project in 2012, I believe. They looked at 3 major legacy newspapers. I'm going from memory here, so if somebody wants to correct me, that's fine. I believe it was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the LA Times or the Washington Post, but major newspapers, and they analyzed their op-ed pages to see who was writing on what topics. So women are represented by the light blue lines, and the top subjects that they wrote about were family, gender, and style. So maybe, a personal story about breastfeeding a baby or something like that ended up on the opinion pages, whereas the more weighty topics of like politics, the economy, security were mostly dominated by men. This is just a little snapshot of it, and at this point, several years old. Very little has changed on the op-ed pages of newspapers. And in fact, research shows that the newsrooms in media are also very segregated still. And the news media has made very little progress in bringing more diverse voices into their midst. So universities have done a lot better. And by commissioning a more diverse set of voices from faculty members, we're able to flow into those newsrooms in a way that I find really meaningful, having worked in local news. When something like the travel ban comes into existence, we had Muslim scholars, women, all women, from Texas write about the constitutionality of that in a very authoritative way, and then that flowed into newspapers in the middle of the country. So we really think it's important for the work that we do. So let's talk about some of the different kinds of topics that we covered, put some of the stories into different categories. One thing we do is we like to add context to the news. We want an electorate who is well-informed, citizenry. So this is an example by Lee McIntyre in the audience. No? Okay. One of your colleagues here at BU who wrote about the death of facts in relation to the Mueller hearing. This was obviously a huge news story that was covered by outlets big and small around the country, but not quite with this lens. This lens was unique, and the story was very well received. Another type of story that we do is pegged to just not to the news so much as to an anniversary, a holiday. Maybe you have a book coming out that's acceptable kind of news peg, or maybe you have new research that is coming out that you've just published in a scholarly journal that works as a news peg for us as well. So this is another BU scholar, Jay Zagorski. We call him Jay-Z, as you probably do too if you know him. This was pegged to Halloween and about how Americans spend so much money on pet costumes, $500,000. So I mentioned before new research. Again, this is a BU scholar who had some research about how much greenhouse gases were emitted by the military, the US military. So this story, obviously climate change is a huge topic that people are interested in. New ways of covering that are always very popular. So she had something new to say about, a new angle, a new sort of lens into climate change that focused on the military. And you can see sort of at the bottom what's there. That's what we call a statement of expertise. That's something that almost all of our stories have in some form. it's so important to us to commission stories from people who are real experts on the topic that we ask them all to include this little paragraph where they say why people should listen to them. This is sort of like an anti-fake news effort on our part. So knowing that we require that is also a good way of like framing whether or not a story that you have in mind is actually in your wheelhouse. If you couldn't write this statement of expertise, then maybe you're not writing about the right topic. You want to be able to say, who have studied this for 40 years or who recently published a book or who has new research on this topic, and explain why we're listening to your point of view. Sometimes stories just scream out like to be brought out of academia and into the public sphere. So if something really big is happening in the world in which you're immersed, but you don't see it in the popular press, but you feel like people need to know about it, this would be a good example of that important scientific discovery or change that that deserves to be highlighted more. We call them big ideas. And this is one of my favorite kind of stories that we do because we do them so well, and academics are uniquely qualified to do them. They're explainers. It's usually very tied to something that's timely. These are short pieces. You might think of them as sort of like Conversation Articles 101. When we're asking something very basic and they're very focused. So examples like defining the Common Core, how do slot machines work? What is heaven? That one's actually fairly complicated, but we thought maybe we could do it easily. One about ISIS and Daesh, this is sort of conversation lore. This story goes back to 2015. It was at a time when ISIS had attacked France, and Hollande, I think, was the president of France at the time, and he kept speaking of Daesh. And Americans were very confused because it wasn't a word that they had been exposed to before. We call ISIS, or IS, or the Islamic State group. So we did a quick piece. It was maybe 600 words just explaining why the French had adopted a different term and what was behind that. It was done in a day and went out and was very well received. And this was we were 5 years old, so that was 4.5 years ago approximately. It was one of the stories that taught us that academics can write fast and will sometimes step up and do something like that. It was very impactful. Maggie mentioned I'm a deputy editor. I oversee 10 of our editors who cover politics, economics, education. And one of the things that I oversee is a grant that we have from the Mellon Family Foundation, which challenged us to commission 150 pieces from humanities scholars. So we work with English professors, we work with philosophers, we work with all sorts of folks. And we find that we can take their knowledge and apply it to the news more readily than might be evident at first blush. So can anybody guess what the news hook of this story was? You don't read it. Don't read it because it's up there. This story about a transgender soldier in the ancient Roman army. Yeah, exactly. When Trump wanted to ban transgender people from being in our army. So probably most people thought that this was a new problem, but it has a longer history than you would guess. So this is another slide that sort of helped you frame up your story, and maybe we'll keep it up. We'll put it back up once we break the formal part of this presentation. Maggie and I are going to stick around after we finish to answer your questions, but also to meet you one-on-one if you have a story you want to pitch. So this is sort of another way, a reminder of the things that you want to ask yourself as you start formulating a pitch. You know, if you were in the elevator, the slow elevator that brings you up here, you know, it's like, you know, the classic example of an elevator pitch. Could you say it in a sentence what it is that you want to write about to someone who's a non-expert in the field? And some other examples, some other leading questions that can help you frame your story. So practically, how do you do it? You can definitely work with your comms team. Always a good idea to reach out to them. But if you're the self-starter type, you can pitch us directly from our website. This is a kind of old screenshot of our website. It looks different now, but this part looks the same on the right side. There's a form there that says pitch an idea. Click on that, and it will take you to this web form. People are often reluctant to fill out web forms, but this one actually doesn't go into some dusty inbox. It flows into our editors' inboxes and into a system where we keep scrupulous track of all the pitches and make sure they get responded to. And it just asks you some leading questions to help you fill it out, and it asks you to choose a topic, but we share them, so if you pick the wrong topic, that won't be disastrous. We'll make sure that the right people see them. We get back within a week. We try to get back faster if it's a very timely pitch. So this is us. And we'll be happy to take any questions you guys might have. Oh. Yeah, is there anybody in the audience who's written for us already? Yeah, oh my gosh. Ooh, okay. No wonder I have so many faces. Would you like to say anything about your experience? You're welcome to come up and talk about it. If you have anything you'd like to say. No? Or stay in your seats. No?
I'll say something.
Okay, great.
Hi, everybody. My piece was an op-ed that was tied to a journal article that I'm pretty sure nobody read. But then I wrote, an 800-word kind of version of it, which was a more fun spin on it. And I think I got like 4,000 hits or something. So, it was just, and it was about orphans and vulnerable kids in Africa. And so I was working with the editor at the Africa desk, and it got a lot of hits in Africa, and particularly in South Africa. So that was nice too.
Oh, awesome. I'm sorry, and could you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Beard from the School of Public Health.
Anybody else? Yes. Okay.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Barakat. I'm at the Pardee Center, and I didn't write for the conversation, but I run a summer fellows program for graduate students every year. And a couple of years ago, we had a graduate student who is doing some really interesting work on the ethics and wildlife and wilderness preservation. And so he was part of a seminar. Jenny Weeks, who's the environment editor at The Conversation, came to this seminar, heard him talk, asked him to write a piece, which he did. And based on that piece, he got an interview. He was asked to participate in a call-in radio show in Wisconsin during hunting season to talk about the ethics of hunting and wildlife. And his piece was picked up and republished far and wide. And so that was really great and exciting for him. He was still a PhD candidate at that time. But he always notes that and thanked us profusely because he really got a lot of mileage out of that.
Yeah, on average, each piece is picked up by, it's published on our site, obviously, but on average, each piece is picked up by 18 or more additional outlets. So it's not unusual, the republication. A lot of that happens through our association with the AP. But some interesting things just happen serendipitously with editors at other sites who know to visit us and some exciting things happen. But then we also have 2 people on staff who actively reach out and pitch everyday's stories to people that they have personal relationships with and that they understand their editorial needs. And so it's not just like a mass email, it's more like, hey friend, here's a story that we really think would work for your readers. Would you like to run it? So it's a pretty big effort to get the widest possible reach possible.
Hello, I'm Catherine Lusk with the BU Initiative on Cities. I have published with you. It's been a seamless and wonderful process. Thank you. But I also wanted to add that, and I would actually say our faculty through the Menino Survey of Mayors have also published multiple pieces, which is a great way, again, when you have to have a complimentary op-ed with you all when you're also publishing a report, particularly a public policy report, to reach a wider audience. But what I wanted to add was a few weeks ago, I was at the University of Toronto at a convening of Urban Institute directors from probably 25 different universities around the world. And we were all talking about, how can we all collaborate? And I said, does anyone know the conversation? And every hand in the room went up. So I think, kudos to you guys for the strength of the global platform, but I also just want to say to people who have international collaborators, I've never done it, but it was an interesting example of if you do have an international collaborator, this is one forum where you can co-publish together to reach multiple audiences in multiple languages, which I thought was really powerful and something that I was actually, until I asked the question in that room, I was totally unaware of the genuine reach and awareness among international universities. And this was Africa, Asia, Europe. I mean, it was a really, 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 really broad population of folks.
Thank you for that, yeah. We do have a lot of people who write articles for us in collaboration. Do you want to speak a little bit about that? We can accommodate multiple bylines, but we do like the people who get the byline to actually be writing and not just research partners. Right. Do you want?
So, in science, especially, sometimes a journal article will have like 20 authors. We try not to go quite to the LIGO gravitational waves level that the authors take up a whole page. And we try to focus it on collaborators who are actually writing the article for the conversation. But we're very open to a couple of co-authors, even 3 is pretty standard for us. And oftentimes, it's a great way for a younger scholar to get their name out, kind of like what you were just describing from the Party Center. PhD candidates can write for our site as long as they stay very narrowly focused on their own research, and they can co-author perhaps with their the professor that they're working most closely with, and that's a way to help them advance their scholarship. It's also a way, if you are very, very busy, you might be interested in sharing the load with another colleague. And you both have the same access to our editing platform. We edit everything online, and basically our own version of a Google Doc. There's one most up-to-date version that we all have access to, and that same approval process happens if there's more than one author. Yeah.
I guess I have 2 questions. One is, would you say that these sort of classifications of stories is pretty common throughout most kinds of forms of journalism with regard to op-ed that is based on research? So the sort of explainer, sort of all the sort of various 4 kinds that you talked about. And then could you elaborate a little bit more about if you're writing an 800-word piece or 1,000-word piece, what's the sort of prototypical structure that you're looking for? So is there a example in the beginning and that sort of brings people in, and then there's the explanation afterwards? Or how does, what kind of structure works in this format?
Okay, I'll take the first question. The second question is about structure, and the first question was about how our approach compares to other media outlets' approach for.
You sort of had 4 kinds of stories.
Yeah.
Is that pretty typical for journalism per se, or is that just more?
No, I think it's pretty idiosyncratic for us. I mean, so we've existed in the United States for 5 years, and So in many ways, we're still a startup, and we are constantly sort of experimenting with what it is that makes sense, particularly for us to do within our model. And not everything we've tried has been successful. I would say like most of our stories are sort of 1,100 word news analysis pieces, or pieces about a new piece of research or scientific discovery. But we're experimenting with something we call Curious Kids, which are like questions from kids, specifically aimed at some newspapers who still run like kids pages. But also it's just like a more fun way to explain something like, I just did one on what's a whistleblower. But it's written at a 6th grade level, very timely. But it's a very sort of fast-moving 500 words on the history of whistleblowers in the United States. And we're experimenting with video, for example. We have a video producer who's doing stories direct to video. And that grew out of it grew out of some acknowledgement that not everyone has the time to sit down and go through this sort of elaborate editorial process. Some people, would rather do something quick. Some people are doing research that's incredibly visual. So we just wanted another tool, like a different way of telling stories.
Well, can I add one thing to that?
Yeah.
One thing that's different about the story types that we listed and what you might see on another publication's op-ed page is that we don't build to some kind of exhortation at the end that's like, I've built my case and now like all Americans should join hands and do this one thing that's gonna, stop climate change or whatever. People might draw their own conclusion at the end of what the best course of action might be, but we're not asking you as a scholar to necessarily prescribe what we should all be doing. And a lot of times when I say that, academics are like, good, I'm not actually comfortable making that step. So that's something that's quite different on our site, that you're writing in the first person based on your expertise, but not based on your opinion, and not necessarily with a big call to action.
Yeah, I would say most openings, like for academics to write for other publications, would be pure opinion. And those pieces are expected to have a very strong point of view for the most part, and so that they know. I'm not sure why, but just they're easier to understand. That's a more traditional form, and if you have a point of view, it's a great thing to do. But not all academic work really lends itself toward prescriptive statements. It's more like, this is what I know. Take it away. Maybe more what we do. And the second question was about structure. Well, in journalism, we have something called the lead, which is usually what was beaten into me when I worked in newspapers was 12 words in your first paragraph. 12 words, that's all you get. You want to say something pithy and draw people in. I'm sure you teach students to do this too, to sort of have a hook at the beginning of the story. And then we almost always, not always, there are no exactly firm rules, but we do see value in that statement of expertise, and that's usually in our intro. And then we usually end the intro of our pieces with why should you care about this? Like, why is this important to society or parents or pet owners or whatever? And then from there, it's usually you go into the meat of the essay. I personally don't like conclusions. I didn't when I taught, and I don't really like it when I edit, so I usually don't have conclusions. But there's a lot of individual sort of style between our editors, and also we really try to let the contributors have their own voice and not really tell them how to do something beyond the conventions of what we know will work. So it is very much a give and take. we're trying to learn from each other and not be too rigid.
I would say your instinct that you said to start with an example or kind of like a scenario, oftentimes we do that as a way to grab people's attention. People tend to connect to stories, so that's a way to get some kind of narrative into an article that might actually just be about numbers, you know, some demographic thing, but we can include a little anecdote or something, either from your own research, or sometimes there might be some, like a new movie that's out or a book that everyone's reading that you can pull a character out of and then be like, well, I can't think of a good example of a character, but you know, Ebenezer Scrooge did this, and then you get into your whole story that flows from whatever little tidbit you put at the top. There was one other thing I wanted to mention. We get a bunch of our story ideas as pitches, as we call them, from scholars like you coming to us. We also reach out when there's things that we think of that we're interested in covering, and we research and try to find the folks who are doing the work that we would want to have them write about. So you might get a phone call or an email from us. We also are in touch with the comms people of our member schools. So every morning, the folks at the Boston University, I'm not sure who gets them, but they get a list of story ideas that we're actively chasing. So it always helps to make sure that these ladies know what you're working on. So when we get in touch and say, it's a bumper year for acorns, is it a mast year for oak trees? And then they're like, oh, I know just the ecologist who's working on this question. So just be aware that you might get an email in your inbox at some point that says the conversation is looking for someone about whatever, and now you'll know to open that email and think about maybe responding.
Maggie, you also asked me to remind you to talk about timing and embargoes and.
Sure. So thank you for the reminder, Emily.
You're welcome.
On the science side, we do publish a ton of articles that are based upon newly published research. And a great time to get in touch with an editor at The Conversation is when you have research that has just been accepted to a journal. Get in touch with us, suggest one aspect of it that you think might make an engaging story for general readers, kind of a lay person's version of whatever your article is about. And we, of course, abide by embargoes, and it's a great way to give yourself a little bit more time, because we often don't know what's coming out in journals until either they're live, or as journalists, we get 3 or 4 days sometimes of advance notice. If you get in touch with us a month or two in advance, that gives you a lot more time to work on stuff before other journalists start calling you and asking you questions in that embargo period right up before publication. So I encourage you to think about that as part of your process when maybe you'd be letting the communications people at Boston University know that you have something coming out. You could also put in your process, I wonder if The Conversation might be interested in something.
And
like
that
this.
also allows us to say, this exciting research just published this week. That creates an automatic news peg for a story.
Yeah, and then we can go live like right when that embargo lifts or right when the journal goes live.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's very exciting. Other questions?
So not all of our intellectual work is our original research. In some cases, we're responding to what we see as a deficiency.
Not all of our research may be that would be appropriate might be original research. Some of it might be responses to cutting-edge books that just came out that have some controversial ideas. Some of it might be responses to the communications that are sponsored by some of the big foundations that we feel are inadequate or slanted. And is that the kind of appropriate work? I mean, they're usually, as I think about how I respond to some of these issues within my own professional blogs, they're 500 to 1,000 words. And I'm just wondering if that's appropriate to sort of pass on to you folks.
Well, I mean, we would evaluate that the way we would any pitch. Like, So you mentioned responding to a statement of philanthropy. Like, so my first question would be is that something like that the general public is aware of or needs to be aware of or would be interested in? We have some unusual editors at the conversation. We have an editor who focuses on data, who has a degree from MIT, which impresses me. And we have 2 editors at this point who are focusing on religion, which is almost a topic that is ignored by the popular press in many ways. I just went to a conference of religion journalists. There weren't too many people there. And we have a philanthropy and nonprofit editor as well. So, I mean, she would evaluate it the same as we would any pitch. And one thing she would want to know is like, is this really are you commenting on something that's at the heart of your scholarship? Have you published something on this topic? Are you a professor of nonprofit management or something? Do you have some sort of credential that qualifies you to comment on it?
One thing about, you mentioned a blog, which made me think everything that we publish has to be original to the conversation because of the Creative Commons license that we have. Once it goes live on our site, we're very happy for it to spread far and wide, but it can't be something, it can be an excerpt from your book. You can write about the topic of your book, but we can't have word for word pullovers.
Yeah, sentences, the ideas can be, right. Yeah. The other thing I want to mention, is that, we do get a lot of pitches and we turn down a lot of pitches, but that doesn't mean that the idea is not a good idea. It just means that it doesn't really work within our model, or we already did a story on that, or, there are a lot of idiosyncratic reasons why we might turn down a pitch. Frequently it's because it's of too narrow of an interest, but it might be a great story for, say, local media. For the Boston Globe might want something that has to do with Boston history, but sometimes those kinds of pieces just don't work for us because it's hard to imagine people outside of this area caring about that topic. Or maybe you really want to express an opinion. There's nothing wrong with wanting to express an opinion, it's just not our approach. So if that's really what you want to do, then it would be more appropriate to look at the major news outlet opinion pages and approach them. The New York Times is always, people are very excited to place there, but they have a very broad opinion section. So just, we're not, I'm just trying to express that we're not sort of like the final arbiters of what's a good idea. We're really looking at ideas about whether or not they fit into our what we want. But there are a lot of places to publish out there. Yeah.
Can you give an example of, using the same sort of topic, an example of what you would consider expressing an opinion versus, because I think it's all opinion. I mean, it's based on expert research and what we do in our fields, but if we're taking the time to write something up about the work that we've done, we've got an agenda here. We're trying to get some information out to move the policy conversation or something. Otherwise, I wouldn't take the time to do it. So I'm trying to figure out if you can use like maybe a specific example of, say, if you took this slant, that would be too opinionated for us. Mm-hmm. This would be okay. Right.
No, you're right. It's a very nuanced. Discussion around opinion, like what is opinion and what we consider okay. And of course, yeah, people are always choosing what examples to use. Like there's a lot of ways that their perspective floats in. Let's see.
Well, maybe if there were something that were about what the Trump administration were doing, some academics might have a lot of loaded value words that they would use about what the Trump administration had done, whereas we might prefer to just have the facts laid out and then have you describe the research that you've done that shows that what the administration had done was perhaps not in the best interest of the people that were affected, or something like that.
Yeah. We always considered a great success when we play it down the middle and we're picked up by a news outlet on the right, and the same piece goes to a news outlet on the left. So if you can imagine a piece that goes to Breitbart and Mother Jones, the exact same piece, that we consider that a great success. That doesn't necessarily mean that you consider that a great success, because we want to play it down the middle, but that might not be your agenda, and that's fine. You have a right to set your own agenda. Yeah, a lot of people want to talk about what the administration should or should not do. I'm having a hard time coming up with a really egregious example, but for example, we recently put out a piece on the Civil Rights Act. The Supreme Court is considering whether or not to extend protections to LGBTQ people under the Civil Rights Act, and it doesn't say this is the right decision for the court to take. It just says these are the issues that they're considering, and here's the history of the act and why it protects discrimination in the workplace. It doesn't tell, hey, Judge Roberts, you really need to, it leaves that out and it informs people and allows them to draw their own conclusions, and that's always my preference.
Can I just add one more thing? The more neutral in political tone we can make some of our pieces, the further they can travel and actually get your ultimate message across to people, because sometimes readers would just shut down if they sense that the message is coming from someone with this particular set of beliefs or this particular set of beliefs. And if they can't really detect where it's coming from, they can't filter it out right away. So I think that's part of what we're trying to do, is to sort of strain out some of that polarizing language so that the heart of the research can actually be heard.
It's an
art, not a science.
Yeah, it's not easy, and sometimes we might not succeed, but we are trying. That's what we set out to do.
Hi, thank you. Can you guys hear me? Oh yeah. Hi, thanks for being here today. My name is Lindsay Butler. I'm a PhD candidate in environmental health and SPH and a BU Urban Fellow. Most of my research is in climate change health impacts, and we try to write a lot of op-eds in the H department to help people make the connection between, say, climate policy and everyday health of the everyday American. And I guess I sort of have both a question and a comment about both for the conversation and op-ed writing more broadly, the sort of voice of the early career scientist or the PhD student or the PhD candidate. I found in my experience, when I'm the sole author, it's less likely to be published than when I co-author with my chair, whether he took the lead or I took the lead. But I think there's definitely space for the earlier career scientist in the opinion discourse. And oftentimes we know the most about our topic because that's our job as a PhD student. And so I sort of politely challenge your opinion that, you don't want to be publishing the PhD student, or that the PhD candidate has a really narrow sort of lane to stay in regarding their specific research, but also ask if you have any advice for early career scientists in writing and contributing op-eds and commentary.
Yeah, we do publish PhD students, and I think what Maggie was trying to express is that early career scholars, they've only built, sometimes scholars who are more established, they have a really broad, they've published on a bunch of different topics. but if you've only, say, published one paper, we're going to want you to write about that topic or something very closely aligned to it, because that is what you can authoritatively say you're an expert on. I think that's what Maggie was trying to say. But we will publish PhD students on their own.
I'm doing that today, actually. Someone at Carnegie Mellon who's working in a soft machines lab about new soft robotics technologies and stuff, and he is one of the authors on a paper. He's talking about that, and he's also pulling in other examples in the area that he's working in that aren't even from his lab, but from other folks who are working in that arena. So I didn't mean to leave the impression that I only want you to tell me, like your exact thesis final conclusion, but we wouldn't want you to, if you're in environmental health, we don't necessarily want you writing about politics or something. Although obviously they're related.
Yes, they are.
So it seems like you have a dichotomy between expertise and bringing in your hard research versus point of views and opinions. And I think, so I don't think in this political climate I have the stamina to voice my opinions, even if I feel strongly about stuff. And I think a lot of my research is just too narrow. If 5 people love me for my mind, I'm fine when I publish a new result, and I don't really care about the world, what the world thinks. But then there's an in-between where for 25 years, maybe it's because I have too many women PhDs in my immediate family, but you think about gender issues differently, and you picked up a lot of books, and you have this aha moment, like there's a NOVA thing called Bright Boys. It's about the whirlwind computer. At MIT, there's a book called Bright Boys. But you know that project was headed by a woman who got a PhD, couldn't get an academic job, and the person who, so the fact that PhDs granted to women peaked, in mathematics, peaked in the 1930s in this country. All of computing was dominated by women, and it was all done in by the GI Bill, is well documented if you read the right stuff. And once you know that, you go to a book where every person in the book's a male, you look in the index for the name you're looking for, and one place in the book, it was headed by a woman. Or for BU, Sham's numerical analysis, Francis Sheed, this guy in the math department, while it was a liberal arts college and no engineering and math was a liberal arts thing, he was sending women to MIT to work in computing. And these stories are kind of lost. And so I think there's room for a duh question. Why is it that we're rediscovering, or we have to go to Hidden Figures and we ask, well, how is it that African-American teachers were laid off at some point? They went to work for NASA. And these things always seem to be surprises, but maybe if we just pull together 10 of these sources and ended up with a duh question, which is not an opinion, it's a duh question, and it's not my hard research, it's the way I would argue with a young woman saying, like, some really ask amazing questions. They know they can do all this stuff. They just ask, is it worth working in this field? And is there room for that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's still writing from a place of expertise. Like you were there and you experienced.
I wasn't there. This was before I was born.
Well, but you weren't there. But you understand the development of a culture and of a field based on being immersed in it. Then, I think you can make an argument that you're an expert in that field. But I mean, again, like we very carefully consider the perspective that the scholar is bringing to a piece, and we look at your published works. We look at journal articles. We want to see what you've done. We do some homework to see if we really feel like we can write a statement of expertise that stands up. I mean, our ultimate goal when we publish something is to make sure that we kind of try to internet proof your arguments, like what is a troll going to say about this person? And we want to make sure that you're really on solid ground so that once a piece is published, you're glad that it's out there, So not that people are saying, why is this guy talking about this? He's a man, he's a white guy, like he wasn't even there. Like what does he know about it?
And also most men who feel they're experts because they have a daughter or a wife, it's boring because they just want to bully in context. So,
Right.
But I think if it's kind of like a book review for 10 underappreciated books, and the fact that you pull those books together gives it credibility, though there's no reason for the author to have credibility.
Yeah.
I don't think that's prerequisite.
Yeah. I mean, we evaluate a lot of pitches every day. So, I mean, sometimes, we're looking to first convince ourselves that we're dealing with a real expert in a subject. And the reason why is because we want to be able to, the reader to feel like they're in good hands as well.
And if somebody could help me with this other one, this Helen Keller going from Perkins School to the Blind to Alexander Graham Bell student at BU to finishing Radcliffe, there are so many weird assumptions about gender and what people can do there. And it's all kind of scandalous if you read the biographies. If somebody could work on that story, or I can give them sources. It is. Anyways, I'll stop right here.
Okay. We have another question up here in the front.
Would you rather us go through BUPR or contact you guys directly?
Don't care. Whatever works for you.
What's the advantages of each on your end, at least?
Well, it might be an advantage for you to bounce your idea off of someone in BUPR first who could help you if you're not super comfortable with thinking about like, well, why is this idea timely? Is my research, can I tie this to something that's happening in current events? They're probably more adept at that than many academics who haven't practiced that skill yet might be. But there's not really, from our perspective, we evaluate the pitches the same way, however they come in. So if you feel like you have a great idea and you guys don't care, we encourage you to just use our website and get it in front of the right editor. I will add a caveat though that I strongly urge you to get in touch with an idea before you sit down and write 800 words. Yeah. It can save you a lot of frustration if you spend your weekend writing and we get the pitch on Monday morning and we've already commissioned something very similar. That can be a very frustrating experience for you. If we talk before you start writing, we can make sure that it doesn't overlap with something else we already have in the works, or maybe the angle that you have doesn't feel quite right for what we think our general readers would be into, but we can help direct you where we think it might work better. So that's one caveat that I would share with everyone, no matter where the pitch comes from, make sure it's actually a pitch and not 1,000 words.
So it's more like 5 sentences or something?
Yeah, a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah. Did you guys want to say anything about that as far as like working with BU or?
Yeah, just to echo what you both have said, I think it's based on your preference, if you feel very confident in your idea, and especially if you've done op-ed writing before or worked with the conversation, you are more than welcome to reach out to them directly, but we are always here as a resource to help gut check your idea, to identify maybe what audience you're trying to reach and refine your pitch before you do reach out if you want us to help you increase your chances of success, or if you're kind of newer to writing for the conversation in other publications. So you can always feel free to reach out to us, and some of our cards are actually on this table, but you can also reach us at pr@bu.edu.
Okay, we've been at it for 70 minutes, so if you want to get up and like leave, that's fine. Yeah, but we're gonna hang around for some one-on-one conversations. If anybody wants to do some speed pitching, we're happy to hear your pitches. Maggie, as you've figured out, is more on the science side. I'm more on the non-science side, for lack of a better way of expressing that. Happy to meet you and talk through, things that you might have on your mind. Thanks so much.